Hi everyone, sorry we had some technical difficulties and I hope everyone can hear us now. I'm going to go ahead and start over, but if you cannot hear us, please respond in the chat box at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Again, good afternoon and thank you for joining our webinar today where we're discussing reporting on criminal records. My name is Chidi Umez and I'm the project manager for the Criminal Records project here at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before getting started, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work. Again, as I said, if you cannot hear us, please place a response in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We will also be answering any content and technical questions in that chat box as well as we go through. We'll have a Q&A portion at the end where we'll answer as many content-related questions as possible. If you still can't hear or you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. But for the technical issues we won't be able to resolve today, we are recording the content portion of this webinar, and we will post it on our website, the cleanslateClearinghouse.org, and that should be online in a couple of weeks. So presenting with me today is Corinne Ramey, who prefers to go by Corey, who's a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. We're happy to have Corey join us in this discussion today and to bring in the journalist perspective and to share some of her work and experience in this area. So to begin the webinar, I'll start by talking a little bit about the national criminal record landscape, some of the ways in which records are acquired, and how a criminal record affects various aspects of people's lives. I'll also talk about policies that states are using to mitigate these effects, focusing primarily on criminal record clearance policies generally, and the Clean Slate Clearinghouse website as a resource that journalists can utilize in their reporting. Last but not least, Corey will share some of the stories she's written and tips uncovering criminal record stories. So as I said before, I'll start with a brief overview of the national landscape. I want to start by talking generally about what is encompassed in a criminal record and how it can be used. So when we're describing a criminal record, we're describing the legal documentation of a person's contacts with the criminal justice system. This includes detailed or summary information about all arrests, misdemeanor and felony convictions, sentences, and community supervision violations. It also may include information when charges are dropped against a person, when cases are dismissed, when someone is found not guilty, or when someone is found not guilty of a crime. The way these records are collected and made available differ from state to state, with some states having a central repository of all these records, while in other states, each agency, law enforcement, courts, probation, and parole, keeps their own individual record of a person's history. Understanding how states collect these records is also important to understand how these records are made available for viewing and for what purpose. Law enforcement officials, including police officers and prosecutors, often use a person's record to see how their history may impact any current charges. A person's record can help prosecutors make informed decisions in their prosecution practices and judges in sentencing. The recent conversation around criminal records has taken a particular focus towards the use in employment practices, with research showing that about 87% of employers conduct criminal background checks, and more states are looking at the use of criminal records in their occupational licensing process. It's important to note as well that a criminal record not only impacts the individual, but also their family and the economy. For an individual, research shows that having a criminal record reduces the likelihood of receiving a job offer by nearly 50%. And in 2011, approximately 180,000 women were subject to a lifetime ban on TANF benefits because of their criminal record. The U.S. economy loses about $87 billion when people with records are unemployed or underemployed. And this hits especially hard for areas that are experiencing shortages in the labor market. This impact is greater for communities of color. A study by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2015 found that Black women and men were incarcerated at higher rates than white and Latino men and women. Particularly that Black men were about 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, with 2,613 Black men being incarcerated compared to 457 white men, and that is per 100,000 in 2015. As a person moves to the criminal justice system, there are decision points and opportunities to determine whether a criminal record will attach, starting from the point of arrest through probation or parole. And so incarceration or imprisonment is just one point at which a person acquires a criminal record. So given what we know about the many consequences of having contact with the criminal justice system, even something as simple as a non-conviction arrest may inhibit certain opportunities and access for people of color. Outside of the societal stigma that sometimes creates barriers to access for people with criminal records, some state and federal statutes and regulations or collateral consequences also place restrictions on the ability of people with a criminal record to access employment, occupational licensing, housing, voting, and education and other opportunities. The National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction, or the NICCC, is a searchable database of the collateral consequences in all U.S. jurisdictions, and this is a project that's funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and part of the Criminal Records Project here at the Justice Center. This database catalogs over 40,000 federal and state collateral consequences, of which over 31,000 are permanent restrictions. And permanent in this case meaning that there is no specified time limit for how long a person is restricted from that particular activity, that right, or the benefit. So with the imposition of these collateral consequences touching several aspects of the lives of people with criminal convictions, primarily their ability to obtain employment, more states are looking to different mechanisms, including ban the box or fair chance hiring, certificates of rehabilitation, and criminal record clearance policies to mitigate the effects of a record for their residents and help individuals move beyond their criminal records. And so the term criminal record clearance is used generally to describe the process of removing or restricting access to information from a person's criminal history. States differ in the terms that they use for this process, and here we've listed some of the most common ones, including expungement, sealing, vacate, dismiss, and so on. And so you'll hear me say criminal record clearance throughout this presentation as a way to capture all the terms that we've listed here. So as I mentioned, states use different terms to describe the process of criminal record clearance. The effect of the process also varies from state to state. The most common terms across states is, that we've seen is expungement and sealing, and generally for states who have expungement as their clearance remedy, it means that records are destroyed once a person has met the requirements and the clearance process is complete. This could be a physical destruction of the records, deletion, or return of their criminal history information. In theory, and sometimes in practice, expungement relieves the person from disclosing the existence of the record, subject to circumstances that warrant public safety concerns. Sealing is the other term used for the record clearance process that generally limits public access to a person's criminal history report, but usually does not destroy it completely. But depending on the state, the terms expunge and sealing may be used interchangeably, and records may still be disclosed for licensing purposes, may still be used for criminal justice, law enforcement purposes, or by court order, again, depending on the circumstances that create the need for broader access. With the expansion of record clearance policies, we've seen many states focus their clearance legislation on non-conviction information. So these are cases where the arrests are dismissed or the charges were dropped. And for these types of records, a number of states are choosing an automatic or administrative clearance process in order to create some level of efficiency. For states who offer some form of probation or deferral program, the process usually becomes effective immediately. The clearance process usually becomes effective immediately after the individual has completed the probation or deferral program. Juvenile records, which are records obtained before the age of maturity in the state, which is usually 18, are kept confidential in most states and can be cleared under the state's clearance process once the individual turns 18 or completes their sentence. Misdemeanor offenses in most states carry a penalty imprisonment of 1 year or less, and for states that offer clearance for misdemeanors, these policies are usually applied to individuals with 1 or 2 misdemeanors who may be eligible for clearance a few years after completion of their sentence. Record clearance for felony offenses are usually the most restricted types of clearance policies, often prohibiting clearance for sexual offenses or serious violent crimes. And so here we have a map that shows that most states at this time have enacted some form, most states, with a few exceptions, have enacted some form of record clearance policy for felony and misdemeanor convictions. So recognizing the growing trend of record clearance legislation across the country and the efforts to reduce barriers for people with criminal records, the Department of Labor and Department of Justice released a solicitation for an online clearinghouse of record clearance legislation across the country. And so the Clean Slate Clearinghouse is a collaboration of the Council of State Governments Justice Center, Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, the National Juvenile Defender Center, the National Association of Counties, and the National League of Cities. And this clearinghouse was created to support juvenile and adult criminal record clearance across the country by providing up-to-date information on record clearance as well as contact information for legal service providers in all U.S. states and territories. The clearinghouse provides tools and resources for legal service providers currently engaged in record clearance work or those who want to expand their record clearance services, and it provides information to compare record clearance policies across jurisdictions and to learn about best practices. One of the greatest strengths of the clearinghouse is that it is supported by an advisory board of legal professionals, researchers from universities, legal service providers, policy advocates, and people with criminal histories from all over the country who provide the practical, on-the-ground knowledge of the effect of record clearance policies in each state. So that's particularly important because, as I mentioned before, the record clearance process differs in each state. So we find that it's important for us to be aware of state-specific information by convening advisory group members regularly and highlighting state and city news stories. And so these are some of the, if you see on the screen, these are some of the types of stories that we include in our news page, which provides information on local record clearance events, new legislation, or stories that have a national reach. We also have curated stories written by our staff that highlight leaders in the field, emerging research, and brings in various perspectives from people with lived experience, from policymakers, law enforcement, and the courts. Here, you'll see our Learn About Your State page, which provides up-to-date summaries of adult and juvenile clearance policies in each state, which can be a place where reporters begin gathering information on current state policies. Again, a lot of this information is informed, like I said, by our advisory committee and our advisory group members who provide that on-the-ground information about these summaries and how the statute is changed and affects those residents in the state. And we've also included the statutory language for attorneys and other legal professionals who want to see the concrete statutory language. So understanding that these policies can be complicated, especially in practice, we've included a national directory of legal service providers who particularly focus on record clearance practices and representation, but also cover a wide variety of representation across criminal justice issues. And the last page here I want to highlight is the Compare States page, which includes a map that allows users to filter through and to see different policies across the states and how we, and so you can see, you can compare across convictions, the details of the record, the process, whether the record clearance process in the state is automatic versus a petition-based, and the waiting period that's required in each state. And so you're able to do a quick glimpse of the states that have the different policies across the filters above. And so what we're really trying to do in future iterations of this page is to have the ability to compare 3 states and do a quick compare of the policies in 3 particular states. And so with that, I will turn it over to Corey to share some of her experience in covering stories involving criminal records.
All right. So when you guys first asked me to do this, I think I thought, oh, criminal record stories. Like, I don't write criminal record stories. Or that I didn't think about it as sort of a category of story. But criminal records sort of intersect so many different kinds of stories and so many different kinds of stories that I've done, whether it's about education or jobs or immigration or housing or policing, and they come up in different ways and affect people's lives in different ways. So I guess if I'm thinking about like how to write these sorts of stories or how to find these sorts of stories, one kind of story that you were kind of talking about in your slides is policy stories, that different states have different policies, and especially ones that are changing. And if I were specifically looking for, say, something new or newsy to write a story about, I might start by looking at states that have brand new policies or states that have, say, you can do the next slide, I think, or states that have recent changes. So like here you have North Carolina, and if I were like a local newspaper reporter in North Carolina, I might want to see what this new law means for people. Like this is, when you read laws like this, they're super technical and it's unclear how this would affect anybody. So I might want to know, like, what does it mean that it reduced the waiting period to expunge a record? And what do people actually have to do to expunge their record? And are people actually doing this in the first place? And to do that, I would likely, I suppose I'd want to find the real people who this affects in the first place. And I might start by, say, contacting the sorts of legal organizations that you guys have on that page, on your Find a Lawyer page, and see if they could steer me in the right direction of, are folks actually trying to expunge their records? Like, what is the impact of this law here in North Carolina? Another way to go about this is looking at proposed legislation. You have this, the Pennsylvania thing here, and I think you can always write stories about proposed legislation and sort of why has this been proposed, what does this mean, who would this affect? And in this case, I would probably call up the presumably person or people who introduced this and say, why bother? Like, the fact that you introduced this makes me think that this is a problem, that there are people who have been convicted of marijuana possession, that their criminal record is somehow inhibiting their ability to get into college or find a job or anything else. And I'd probably interview them. Ideally, I'd want to find a person who this actually affected, who I could have in my story, because I think what makes stories that involve criminal records meaningful and worthwhile is having the real people in your stories. And I can talk a little bit about how to find these people, if that works for you. Yeah. So finding people with criminal records to be in stories is the kind of thing that you would think really would not be that hard, because the reality is there are tons of people who have criminal records. But somehow finding them and convincing them to be in the newspaper I have spent so much time doing this. And I can tell you a few ways that I have tried and failed and succeeded. One is let's say I'm doing a story so I'll tell you about one story I wrote that took a lot of work to find these people. The New York City Housing Authority, you probably know, it's been in the news recently. They just entered into a consent decree with federal prosecutors. There's this rule about that certain people are on this list that if you have a criminal record, the person is not allowed in a relative's apartment. So, like, let's say, Chidi, that you have a criminal record for drug possession or something, and your grandma lives in NYCHA. You might be on some specific list that you can't go visit your grandma. And if you do go visit your grandma and you get caught in her apartment, your grandma could lose her lease and then would lose her home. So I wanted to write about this policy because NYCHA was looking at it and thinking about changing it, and there's clear arguments there's good arguments on both sides of this. Like, there are people in NYCHA who say, like, we don't want people selling drugs right in our building. We're trying to clean up our buildings, and so if you, in fact, have sold drugs, like, there's reasons we might not want you in the building. And so I was determined to find people for this. And I tried, and I called advocacy groups, and I called lawyers, like the kind of public defender lawyers who represent people in these situations. I went to the building where people go to this, like, sort of kind of like fake court situation where they can fight this, and I stood in the lobby, and just everything failed. And I eventually found NYCHA used to have this they still have a newspaper. It's like a tenant newspaper. And they used to actually list the names of people who have criminal records and the people who are not allowed in NYCHA. So I found the old versions of this newspaper. I made myself a big table of all the people who were banned from NYCHA. And so my memory of this is the newspaper actually had the addresses and the apartments. And I went, and I spent an entire day knocking on doors, like just going to these apartments. So it would be like, in this case, it'd be like your grandma. Like, I'd go to your grandma's apartment and say, oh, will you talk to me for my newspaper story? And eventually I actually found people, and they were willing to talk to me. And there was some negotiation involved. Like, I didn't use, because I didn't want to get these people kicked out of their homes. I didn't use their full names, and I think for photos for the story, we sort of did photos like in silhouette. But I did find people, and so sometimes, and I felt like it was worth it too. Like, even though that took a lot of time, these stories, because they're sort of technical, like, it's worth it. It's always worth it to have real people in a story, even if you have to knock on doors to find them. I think another thing, like in thinking about these kinds of stories that I think about is kind of like negotiating with people about what it means to be in the newspaper. And some people, they totally understand that, say, if I'm going to interview you and you have a criminal record, that I can't sort of write around that. Like, I need to say, Chidi was arrested 2 years ago for drug possession, and I can't just pretend like it didn't happen, because that's sort of like part of our obligation as journalists. We can't just sort of gloss over the fact that, yeah, you did get arrested for drug possession. And so in order to be fair to you, I need to tell you that. Like, I need to tell you, this is going to be in the newspaper, and this is what it means to have your name sort of on the internet with something about your criminal record that, say, even if your criminal record eventually gets expunged, if you can't even find this in a database, like, it's going to live on the Wall Street Journal website, and that means when you apply for a job, it's going to be there. And at least for sort of my conscience, I need to make sure that you understand what that means. Sometimes, and I think every publication has sort of different policies around this, and ultimately a lot of these decisions aren't a decision an individual reporter is going to make, that you kind of have to talk to your publication about to what extent do we protect people, and are we willing to use just initials or just your first name, or take a photo that doesn't show your identity, and to what extent we feel like we need all these details in a story. There was one story I did about a policy that was affecting sex offenders, and this was folks who, once they were released from prison, they couldn't live within 10,000 feet of a school, which in New York City there's kind of schools everywhere, so basically there was nowhere for sex offenders to live. And so for this story I wanted to talk to a sex offender. I eventually found one through a really nice kind of advocacy nonprofit that helps folks who are recently released from prison, and met up with my sex offender on Ward's Island, which is a place, it's like an island kind of between Manhattan and the Bronx and Queens, where a lot of sex offenders happen to live in a shelter because there's no schools nearby. So I met up with this guy, and this guy did not understand the internet. He'd been in prison for 30 years. He'd just gotten out. So we had this long discussion about what it means to be in a newspaper story. And he eventually decided that, you know what, he was already on the internet because he was on the sex offender registry. And being in a Wall Street Journal story with his full name and everything he did, which was, I think he robbed a woman, and in the process of robbing her, he reached in her bra. And this, from his perspective, that is what he said he did, and that led to his conviction. He was okay with that because he felt like, at least in the story, he got to say that he was trying to move on with his life, and yeah, he did this when he was 21, and he was high at the time, and hey, at least having those details out there was better than only being on the sex offender registry. But this was a discussion that, like, you know, I wanted to make sure that he understood what that meant. And so whenever I'm looking for people for stories, I make sure that we talk about these things. Chidi, you want to ask anything? Do you have any questions?
Sure. At this point, we'll see if anyone has any questions, but if not, so just going back to talking about how you have the conversation with people about appearing in the story, is there anything in particular that any strategy that you use to gain that trust, or is it kind of situational when you do approach people?
I think it's situational. Like you know, some of it is just establishing a rapport with somebody and being kind to them and listening. But also, yeah, I think it's just asking good questions and listening and understanding, and then sort of being clear about this is what it means to be in the newspaper, and these are some advantages and disadvantages. Most of these people, like, I'll also kind of get to know them over time. Like, it's not just I talk to you for 5 minutes and that's it. It's like maybe I'll meet up with them, and then, you know, I'll call them back and we'll go over some details that are in the story, some sort of fact-checking questions. So by the time there's a story in the paper, like, I feel like I know them and we have a personal relationship.
Okay. You also mentioned this, one of the things you said was if you are reporting on a story, you're talking to someone that you feel like you have an obligation to report that, you know, Chidi was arrested and she had a drug conviction, what the crime was, what the arrest was, the date, and all that information. But a lot of the conversation we've had with our, you know, advocates, with those people with histories, especially regarding criminal record clearance, expungement, is that need to know, that publics need to know where there has been a legal process taken to remove that information from public access. So how do you balance that as far as being accurate in the fact that a person's record has been expunged, but also this idea that you have to report on the facts.
I mean, I think if a story really is about, say, a policy like criminal record expungement, or even something like, you know, here in New York City, turnstile jumpers in the subway have been sort of a thing, and can you get a criminal record from jumping a turnstile? And I think there is an obligation to say what someone has gotten convicted of, even if legally that might be expunged. If that's the subject of the story, I don't think you can write around that. I think you have to say, you know, 10 years ago, you jumped a turnstile and this resulted in a criminal record for reasons X, Y, and Z, even if, say, when you apply for a job, your turnstile jumping doesn't show up.
But do you include the expungement itself in the story as well?
Oh, for sure,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, absolutely, because that would be within what the story is about, that this is no longer, I would tell people, because I'm writing about this subject, this is no longer officially on this person's criminal record.
Okay. We do have a question from a participant, and it says, is there an influx of former inmates wanting to tell their story after one of your story publishes?
I definitely get mail. I definitely get inmate mail. It's often stuff like, would you look into my situation, that may or may not be really that similar to what I just wrote about. And I always read all of the mail, and I sometimes write back. I once had a really nice inmate write me who I actually wrote him first. It was a first story about cats at Sing Sing, and he had saved some cats who were about to be killed, and he wrote me one of my favorite inmate letters ever about how he saved his cats and his feelings on the cats at Sing Sing.
So just the word inmate kind of sparks another conversation that we've been having around language in reporting with some of our some of our advisory board members about just thinking about stories that we've read. I know when we post some of our news stories, we do try to, we are careful about the types of language that we use on the site, both with staff-curated content and with the stories from across the country that we publish. And so talking about this, this issue of language around people with criminal histories, using words like convict or felon to describe people with criminal histories. Can you talk about if that's come up in your work at all and how you are able to tackle that?
Yeah, I think issues around language come up all the time, whether it's, say, writing about immigration and do we use illegal or alien or undocumented, or, you know, when we write about disabilities, should we say disabled people? Do we have to say people with disabilities? And there's sort of several different ways to think about it. One really basic issue is for us is that we have word counts and can't add a lot of extra words to things. Like sometimes we might use something like disabled people, not because we're not trying to be polite to people, but because we don't want to use a longer phrase. But then the other thing is, or two other things. One is there's sort of every publication has a different style book, sort of a different style for how we talk about people. And then I think the third is, as journalists, we want to use language that's as neutral as possible, which might mean, say, not using the kind of language that maybe someone in an advocacy group would prefer that I use. I think what I am careful about is, say, if I interview you and you're from an advocacy group, I'm not going to, if I'm not quoting you directly but sort of paraphrasing what you're saying, I'm not going to paraphrase you with language you wouldn't support. Like I'm not going to have you using the word convict if I know that you, or felon, if I know that's not something that you yourself would use. But maybe I would use that someplace else in the story, if that makes sense.
Okay. Okay. And have you, in your experience, have you had any pushback from folks calling you about a story that you've written, either regarding the language or the information, again, in the situation where they're saying, you know, I didn't know you were going to put all that information, my record has been expunged, you know, trying to get a retraction, trying to have that pulled. We've had a story where someone asked for a story to be pulled, actually, from the paper and the archives. Has that ever happened?
That has not, because, like, we talk about sort of no surprises journalism. Like, really, when someone is in a newspaper story, and it doesn't matter who it is, like whether they're a super important person or they're like Joe Schmo with a criminal record, if they're in a story that I'm writing, they're going to know everything that's in that story ahead of time. They're not going to see the newspaper and be like, oh my God, I didn't know it would say that I was convicted of this. So I think journalists sort of have a responsibility to do that sort of thing. In terms of complaints, the complaints I get the most often are about headlines, which I do not write, and which are often have like a really restricted word count, and so always oversimplify things and use language people might not prefer sometimes, and often there's nothing I can do in those cases.
Mm-hmm. We have another question.
All right.
Here. And it says, in writing to prisoners, I understand there's a massive difference between a language barrier. Do you feel that ever gets in the way? So do you ever feel, I guess, that there's a language barrier when you're talking to folks who are actually incarcerated?
Is this like a language barrier, like they speak Spanish or they speak another language, or is this like a comprehension barrier? I don't know that I've really had that come up, actually.
And then, well, the next question is, this person works for a nonprofit and says, in writing articles, do you have any advice on getting the millennial generation interested in this issue?
Getting the millennial generation interested. I don't know. I mean, I think the millennial generation is interested in a lot of sort of social justice kind of issues. And actually, maybe you should answer that question. This is a little bit outside of my general experience here.
A lot of so we have a few millennials working on staff. And so a lot of the activities that we do and a lot of the projects that we do are to really get a broader attention to this issue of criminal record clearance, especially with the Clean Slate Clearinghouse. So some of the tactics that we use, like I said, are writing articles and testimonials with the people who are affected, which can range you know, from folks who have juvenile records to adults, and so that age range is very wide-reaching. We also have we also have a podcast which is very popular, both for everyone, not just the millennial generation, that really brings on folks to talk about these issues, to have a dialogue with one of our staff members, and that has really gotten a lot of traction for folks, again, who aren't sitting down to read necessarily, but we have those both mediums, both listening and articles, reading articles in order to appeal to everyone and to, again, bring a voice to these issues, to elevate these issues, and to really continue that dialogue.
I mean, I guess I would say, in general, like whether you're a journalist or you work in an advocacy group or a nonprofit, the way to get anyone interested in these issues is having real people and real stories.
Exactly.
And, like, I want to know who that person is who got convicted of marijuana and has a serious medical condition and only had it for treatment reasons. Like, right. When I see this Pennsylvania thing on the screen, it's kind of like, I don't know about that. But if you had that person, like if I could see a picture of that person and know about their story, then I'm interested.
Right. And that, again, stresses, I know, Corey, you mentioned for states, let's say Alabama, that do have those more restrictive policies. Again, for us, really tapping into the practitioners on the ground, finding those people to figure out what does that mean for people, for real people, when they aren't able to access these remedies as they would in other states, and how does that impact even their ability to be mobile. We know that, you know, in this day and age, a lot of people are transient, moving from state to state, but how does their ability to, how does the availability of relief in their state for a criminal conviction affect their ability to move across state? I have another question, Corey, for you. If you can just talk about, like you said, in looking at these, in looking for stories, you're looking at proposed legislation. One of your tactics, or one of the process that you would go through is to contact a policymaker who's enacted this legislation. So can you talk about a little bit about what that is like? How would that reporting differ from when you're talking to people, criminal records? What are policymakers, like what's your approach with them?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's sort of the easy part. You call them up and you ask them, why introduce this policy, or why advocate for it, or that sort of thing. I actually think the more complicated thing is, or the more complicated part, and I think it's okay if you disagree with this, is that as journalists, we have an obligation to get both sides of the issue, and that means finding folks who, say, want to think that in this marijuana example, that, yeah, this person should have a criminal record for possessing marijuana for their medical condition, or in the case of my sex offender, that it's a little simpler, but yeah, there are reasons that we want this sex offender to live on Wars Island and not anywhere, basically, in the rest of New York City. And we need those perspectives in stories, even if, as people, it can, sometimes those perspectives might feel a little cruel, but these people have valid public safety concerns, and they're part of the conversation about how to handle criminal records, and so it's important to put forth the effort to find them and to have those voices in balanced journalism.
Yeah, and we would actually agree on that. Here at the Justice Center, we are a nonpartisan organization where we do present both sides, and one of our primary objectives is the public safety objective. And so even in the Clean Slate Clearinghouse, although it is geared towards shining a light or highlighting criminal record clearance reforms across the state, we are also interested in those diverse voices that do present those public safety issues around it, making sure that the public is, those who access our site are informed about both sides or all the sides of the issue, and again, for reporters, making those informed, making that informed reporting and having the information to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. It says, do you believe journalists are over-dependent on police or prosecutor records when they are reporting on criminal justice matters?
I think it really depends on the reporter and the story. I mean, I think we have to use the records available to us, but anytime I'm going to look at police, or if you look at police and prosecutor records, you also want to see, say, does that person have a lawyer? And if so, I'm going to contact that lawyer and find out their side of the story. So I think journalists just have to be careful about sort of finding balance in general.
That's a good point, because one of the things we have talked about as well is how prosecutors use that criminal history in their in charging, and how courts use it in sentencing. This is a little tangent to the reporting, but also it just talks about how what is the role of that information when you're looking at all aspects of the criminal justice system, including reporting as well.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, go ahead.
I want to know what you think about sort of media coverage of criminal record policies and people with criminal records.
Yeah, so a lot of the conversation that we've had, like I said, with our advisory committee and the folks in the field has been just looking at things that have been done well and things that have been, you know, that where there's room for improvement. And things that have been done well, again, is just this conversation that we're having here about, you know, hearing from a journalist saying that it is important to have people, the voices of the people most affected in the stories, and that has been really what has stood out in all of our conversations with lawyers and advocates alike. Everyone, there's a consensus that that voice is needed, and that perspective is what really needs to be pushed to the forefront. But the one thing that where there is room for improvement is that language piece. Understanding, like you said, there's a word count issue when you're saying people with criminal records versus convict and felon, but really understanding that even with that, there's still a level of responsibility, both with just presenting a human side to the issue when you are talking about a person and in their process of trying to move forward with their life, and not adding to those perhaps legal barriers, or adding to the public stigma that is associated with someone with a criminal history. And so that's just, again, like I said, area for improvement. But even within the community, even in the field, there's still some discord about what is that central language. Is it returning citizens? Is it people with criminal history? But all in all, really presenting a picture of the person, and that this is a person, and that they are beyond, they are more than just what they have done.
Yeah. Are there other, I can tell you I would never use the phrase returning citizens in a story. Like, that is so confusing to people. Is there other language that you see in the media that you find offensive? Or view as sort of inappropriate? Yeah,
what we have heard, again, usually inmate has been relegated to folks who are actually in prison or in jails, or who are incarcerated, but that language can spill over even to those who are released or who are in reentry. There's been conversation that language is still continuing, and they're still an inmate even though they're not actually incarcerated. And yeah, so like I said, words like felon, convict, have been some of the words that we've heard in the field, and again, talking to our advisory committee about just language that people want to kind of move away from, and then really highlighting the people-focused language, so people with a criminal history.
Yeah.
Okay, we have
what is inappropriate about returning citizen? I probably was not clear. I don't think it's inappropriate. I just think that part of what I'm trying to do in a news story is be clear to people who sort of aren't in an advocacy community or don't hear about an issue all the time. And I don't think the phrase returning citizen is something that regular people understand. Like, they think, oh, where are they returning from? Like vacation or Europe or Australia?
And a lot of some of the rhetoric around that is also a person with a criminal record does not have to be necessarily have been in prison. So they're actually not returning from anywhere. And so to be factually accurate, returning citizen or a person with a criminal record is more factually accurate in some cases than a returning citizen.
I think too, like often when I'm trying to think about this kind of language, like just the simplest thing is often the best. Like if I can't figure out what I want to call somebody who's, say, in Rikers, like, you know, the paper we've had discussions, like, are they detainees, are they inmates, like, they haven't necessarily been convicted, like, to just go with the simplest thing possible, like, just say this person is in jail, which is factually true, and to say they've been accused of shoplifting.
Right.
To sort of just get beyond some of this jargon that some people think is offensive and other people think is inaccurate and that sort of thing.
We're coming up to the end here. Let's see if we have any more questions. So from a journalist point of view, this says, do you feel that people of color are more ignored in these stories about prison or prison reform? And I would just say, how would you, given the statistics that I did mention earlier in the presentation, is there a responsibility to highlight these stories, particularly for communities of color?
I mean, I think, like, when I think of stories I've done about prison or sort of prison reform initiatives, there's certainly people of color in them, and I think it's almost something you can't avoid, like it has to be there, or, yeah, more that it's something you can't avoid because it's so much. When I go to prisons or I've gone to jails in New York City, it's part of what you see and what there is, and even if you don't address it explicitly, I think it's part of who you interview and what the story is. Does that answer that question?
I would think so, yes. I would think so, yes. Okay. Do you have any other questions for us about either any of the projects that we're doing with Clearinghouse or how we've seen this issue come up with folks that we're talking to in the field?
I don't think so, but I would say, like, around some of these language issues and that sort of thing, that I always like hearing from readers and from folks at advocacy groups and whoever about things like language. And I like getting criticism from people about, like, I really don't, and it's okay if I disagree with you and I'm not going to change anything and I'm not going to do anything. Like, I like to hear people's concerns, and I try to really, like, even if it won't change a story that's already online, like, I hear stuff and I keep that in mind for future reporting for sure.
Great, and that's a practice that you would encourage for other reporters and colleagues alike.
Absolutely, yeah. It sounds like some of these folks listening are maybe folks at advocacy groups, and yeah, I would encourage you to, like, have a dialogue with reporters, email them. If they don't respond, email them again, because sometimes we get busy. You know, like, people want to hear what you have to say.
Great. Well, it looks like we are coming up on time here. Let me see. We may have time for one more question. Or says, would it be helpful when I guess an advocacy group is pitching an individual story, would it be helpful to provide language that will keep the word count in mind? Does documentation help you to have better information on the story?
So in terms of providing language, when you're first pitching a story, I actually probably would avoid doing that, because there's only so much you can control. I mean, I think that's something that you can discuss later, and certainly when you, like, if you're pitching a story, you can use whatever kinds of language that you naturally use. Like, I don't think in writing a pitch you have to feel like, oh, I have to use the style guide of this particular newspaper that I'm pitching to. But I think that certainly you can relate, if you're having a conversation with a reporter on the phone or whatever, like, have a discussion about language, and I think that's always a good discussion to have.
Are there any, as you're just talking about pitching a story for organizations that feel like they do have interesting stories to relay or to pitch to reporters, is there anything in particular that you're looking for that would be most helpful for you to say, this is a story that I want to follow up on?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good story both has real people in it, but like, just a real person isn't enough. Like, you can't just say, oh, I want to pitch a story about this random person. That random person has to be representative of a new policy, a policy that might is thought to perhaps be harmful, a policy that's thought to be good, a proposed policy. So to make sure there's like some meat to that story, if you want to steer a reporter to some numbers that capture that story, I think we always want numbers in stories. And ideally, I get a lot of advocacy groups sending me reports that they came up with that are perhaps not the kind of reports that I would write a story on because they're just so clearly to one side of the spectrum or the other side. Like, if you're going to steer me to some numbers, maybe steer me to something that's fairly thought of to be a reliable source. Not that these reports aren't, quote, reliable, but like, you know, we would consider like census data or government numbers or things like this, city data, more reliable than sort of an advocacy group report.
Okay. Great. Well, looks like we're coming up, we're right at 1 o'clock here, or a little over 1. So just want to say, again, a huge thank you to Corey for joining us today. I'm sure a lot of the information she shared has been insightful and I hope informative for folks on the phone and for the webinar. And so we want to encourage you, if you do have any questions that you weren't able to ask today, to please email cleanslate@csgjusticecenter.org, and we'll be able to get some answers to some of those questions. And we encourage everyone to sign up to receive information from our newsletters and other announcements about webinars such as this one at cleanslateclearinghouse.org. And with that, we'll say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to Corey, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.